Hi, this is Synthchaser from synthchaser.com, and today I'm here with the lovely and majestic ARP 2600. So this ARP 2600 needs a little bit of help, and it's been shipped to me all the way from China. The owner has taken the front panel off and just sent me the front panel with the circuit boards, and I've hooked it up here to a linear power supply. Back at home in China, he's got it connected to a switching power supply because the old power supply, he said, was broken. He's already done some repairs to it, replaced some shorted tantalum capacitors, looked like he replaced some sliders, but he has some problems with it. Specifically, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 are dead, the sample and hold isn't working, and one of the speakers, I think the left speaker, isn't working. So here I've got it turned on, and this is oscillator 3. Turn it up a little bit. So oscillator 3 is working, but oscillator 2, as you hear, we've got nothing. Oscillator 1, we've also got nothing. So let's take a look and see if these oscillators are really dead or not, because this is a pre-patched synthesizer. When I'm raising oscillator 1 here, I'm raising the square wave. And when I'm raising oscillator 2, I'm raising the pulse wave. When I used oscillator 3, I was using the sawtooth wave. And these oscillators have a sawtooth core. So if we actually use a patch cable and patch the sawtooth over here to the filter, we'll see if the core of the oscillator is actually working or not, or if it's some post-processing that's done to shape the waveform. And the reason that I suspect that might be the case is because he's replaced the oscillator modules, and actually the sample and hold module, but he's replaced the two oscillator modules with new aftermarket replacements, and it didn't fix his problem. So let's check it out. So let's take oscillator 1's sawtooth and patch it over here to oscillator 1's VCF input. Sliders are a bit scratchy, but as we can see, the sawtooth output of this works. The square output is dead. So our problem is probably with the post-processing of this oscillator, where we convert the sawtooth to the square. Now we'll do the same thing for oscillator 2. Actually, we can just leave it patched here. So we'll do sawtooth. And there's nothing coming from oscillator 2. So oscillator 2, there is some issue with that we're going to have to take a look at. So now let's take a look at the sample and hold. These are pre-wired internally, but unfortunately it's only oscillator 1 and 2 that have the sample and hold as inputs to modulate the oscillator. Oscillator 3 doesn't, but that's what patch cords are for. So let's take the sample and hold output from sample and hold, and we'll connect it here to one of the frequency modulators on oscillator 3. So I'm going to turn oscillator 3 on, and we'll plug it in here. And as you can see, the sample and hold isn't working. There is some control voltage because you heard the pitch go up, but it's not the sample and hold output that we would expect. So there is some problem in the sample and hold that we'll look into. And then as we've been doing this, I hear that this speaker is the only one putting output, and the left speaker is dead. So we did verify that problem does exist. So we've got 4 things to look into here. We've got dead oscillator 2, dead square wave output from oscillator 1, faulty sample and hold, and a dead left speaker. Here we have this beautiful keyboard turned upside down, and you can see that basically the backside consists of these boards, which are mostly just the sliders, and a couple chips, and sub-boards and sub-modules. So this is oscillator 1, this is oscillator 2, and this is oscillator 3. He replaced his original, he cracked open and replaced with aftermarket oscillators, and it didn't solve his problems. So we're going to figure out what the real problem is. The speakers here, so this is the speaker that's not working. There's a transformer, and there's some circuitry on this board here, board 5, that drives those speakers. This is the sample and hold module. This has also been replaced with an aftermarket module, and it didn't solve the problem. So let's start taking a look, and we're going to start with these oscillators. This is oscillator 1, and this is oscillator 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to probe the pins, because it's not encapsulated. I can just probe the pins that connect it to the board below. So the first one I'm going to look at is oscillator 1, and then I'm going to go to oscillator 2. And I'm going to look at the supply rails, and I'm going to look at the output. So the first pin here is the minus 15 volt supply, which on oscillator 1 looks okay. Ground, which looks okay. And plus 15 volts, which looks okay. And the output is a sawtooth wave. And here's the output from oscillator 1. And we have a sawtooth wave. And we're not surprised because we knew that the sawtooth output from this oscillator was working. This is the one that we know is not working. So let's take a look. First, the minus 15 supply. And hello! Minus 15 supply is at 15 volts. So that's not surprising then that this oscillator won't work if it's got the wrong voltage supply to it. But let's take a look at the other ones. So ground is ground, plus 15 is 15 volts, and the output is stuck somewhere around 10 volts. So we know that this oscillator is okay, and this one is being fed the incorrect supply voltage, or there's some short on here that's shorting the minus 15 rail to the 15 rail. So let's investigate this further. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do some basic continuity checks to make sure that this oscillator is hooked up correctly. So let's first check the plus 15 rail. So I'm going to touch the plus 15 terminal there, and I'm going to touch the plus 15 on the power supply, and I have continuity. Ground, I'm going to do the same thing, and I have continuity. Minus 15, I have no continuity. Let's see if I have continuity shorted or something to the wrong rail. No, I have no continuity to any power rail on the minus 15 line of this this oscillator. So that's a pretty good reason why this isn't working, because it's missing one of the supply rails. And just peeking under there, I can see right here the trace that comes from this minus 15 rail on this Molex connector, and should come here to the oscillator and continue on. You can see that the trace is broken. The trace is lifted, and it's snapped right there, and that cut is breaking the 15 volt rail, and why this isn't hooked up to 15 volts. So let's just try jumping it and see if we can bring this oscillator back to life. So what I've done here is I've connected a jumper from the pin 8 of the oscillator, which is the minus 15 volt rail, and I've just clipped it on here on the pin sticking out of the Molex connector there for the minus 15 volt rail to restore continuity. And I've turned oscillator 2 up in the mix, so this is oscillator 2's pulse or square wave, I think pulse wave. And now let's plug it in. Looks like oscillator 2 is working now. So we're going to take a look at why the square wave output of oscillator 1 isn't working. So we know the sawtooth is working. And what happens is it comes down here to this op amp, which we're seeing the underside of, and it creates a square wave from that. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow this sawtooth output to this op amp and see where things are going wrong. And here's the relevant part of the schematic. We verified the sawtooth output here on pin 5 of the VCO submodule, and we're going to cruise on up here through this resistor 47 over to this op amp, and we're going to be looking at the input on pin 2 and the output on pin 6, which pretty much gives us our square wave. Alright, so here we are on pin 5 of the VCO, and I'll do this so it looks more interesting, I guess. And then we cruise down here, and it comes onto this resistor 47. So this is on the side that touches the VCO. And we're going to hop over to the other side, and now we're stuck at minus 12.6 volts. So this is pin 2, the inverting input of that op amp. We'll go over to the output, pin 6. It's also stuck low. So it looks like that op amp is shorted. So we're going to pull it out and replace it, and hopefully that'll fix the square wave on VCO 1. So pretty quickly we've come up with possible solutions for oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, and we can move on to troubleshooting the next problem, which is going to be the speaker. So the speaker is driven by an op amp and some transistors on board 5-1, which is this upper board. Board 5 is tucked underneath and has mostly just sliders. So the thing is, the suspect part, of course, would be the op amp. So this would be, you know, if any one of these parts failed, one speaker could be out and the other could be working. So we're going to poke around on and see if this op amp is working. So getting ready to probe the op amp on this board, I touched a part of the board, not where the op amp is, and I burned my finger. So I grabbed the thermal camera, and this is what I saw with a thermal camera. The board is very hot, and there's a couple components underneath that must be burning up. Comparing that thermal camera image with the PCB layout, I can kind of see that this R356 10 ohm resistor and this Q33, which is a transistor, seem to be responsible for the heat. So when we get that board out, we'll troubleshoot the sample and hold first, but when we take that board out, I'm going to test this transistor Q33 and see if it's shorted, because that would explain the amount of heat and why that speaker's not working. Moving on to the sample and hold, we're going to take a look at the inputs and outputs of this 4015 sample and hold module. Again, this is replaced with an aftermarket module, but we're going to do the same thing that we did with the oscillators. We're going to probe on the module and see if it's getting all the inputs that it should be getting. So we're going to start here with the power rails. So the minus 15 volt rail is correct. Ground is correct. Plus 15 volts is correct. Here's the output. So the output is flatlined. Pretty much flatlined. Slightly positive voltage there. This is the noise input. It sure looks like we're getting some noise input. And then over here is the clock input. And the clock is dead. So it's never being told to sample that noise input, and that's why we're not getting any output. So we need to find out why the clock is dead. So this is the clock circuitry, and there's not much going on here. There's a JFET, there's a transistor, just a regular BJT transistor. There's an op amp, and there's a tantalum capacitor there. So let's take a look here at the inputs and the outputs to this op amp. So looking at the clock op amp's output, we have just an unmoving constant voltage there. The input on the non-inverting input, a negative voltage that's not moving, and also on the non-inverting input, on the inverting input, also a negative voltage that's not moving. So a couple possibilities is the tantalum capacitor is shorted, the op amp is bad, or one of the two transistors is bad. So the easiest thing to do is when we take this board out to test the speaker transistor is just to test those parts as well. Alright, so I've pulled the op amp for the internal clock from that board 5-1. That's the most likely component to have failed in that circuit, and we're going to test it in this little contraption that I built. I'll show you what it does. When I connect it here to a battery, I've got a single op amp here, an LM301, and a dual op amp here, an LM1458, and basically it flashes the the little LED if the op amp is working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the known good 301 and I'm going to put in the op amp from this keyboard, and we're going to see what happens. So the LED stays out. So this op amp is bad, and we can go ahead and replace it. And the next thing we're going to test is this transistor, which we've taken out of the preamplifier for the left speaker. And for testing transistors, I use this little doohickey, which I built from a kit that I bought on eBay for a few bucks. And we'll get this transistor in there. I might need to bend the legs a little bit to get it into the little ZIF socket. And we'll turn it on and test it out. And it says that it is fine. It detects it as a PNP BJT, and this is not the problem for our left speaker. So the next thing to look at after the transistor that was getting hot was the op amp that was driving it, and it's another one of these LM301s, and as you can see I put it here in my tester and the LED is staying off. So we have another bad op amp there, and that's fortunate because this transistor is kind of a scarce part, but the op amp is very common. So we should be able to put in 2 new op amps and of course replace this transistor, and hopefully our sample and hold and our left speaker will come to life. So even though we replaced those 2 op amps, one for the sample and hold and one for the left speaker that were bad, we still haven't fixed the problem. The left speaker now makes a very soft kind of white noise, and you can kind of hear the output bleeding through it a little bit, but it's way muted and it's noisy. The sample and hold, the clock input to the sample and hold is still dead. So even though we replaced those 2 parts, we still have others to find and fix. So since we repaired the faulty op amp, we still don't have sound on the left speaker. And I think we have resolved the problems on this board. The problem that I'm seeing now, this is the input for the good speaker. And since that's super annoying, I'm going to turn that speaker off now. And you can hear some static there coming in on the left speaker. And let's take a look at the input to this board. There's no audio signal there. So we did have a bad op amp on this board. But like peeling an onion, we peeled a layer back and we found we now have another problem, is there's no audio input coming to this board. So following that back, since there was no audio signal on board 5 coming up to board 5-1, we're going to go take a look here on board 4. This subboard here, it's board 4-2. Has a preamplifier for the both left and the right side. So we're going to take a look first at the good channel and then at the bad channel. So good channel, the input is there, very low amplitude. The output is here. It's about 2.5 volts peak to peak. This is for the right speaker, which works. And then we're going to look at the exact same, the equivalent op amp for the left channel side. So there on the input side, I can see the input signal, which I didn't see. It wasn't that high amplitude on the right side, but on the output pin 6, it's stuck high. So it's likely that this op amp here in the preamplifier is also bad. Which is causing no audio to make it to the rest of the speaker driver and other stuff. So we're going to take this board up and we're going to pull that op amp and check it out. And sure enough, there's another bad op amp there in the preamp. You can see this is the single op amp that I took out. There's a good dual op amp here, flashing the LEDs. And this one above it is not flashing at all. So we'll replace this op amp and check things out. And with the op amp changed, we're now getting sound out of that left speaker. speaker. So one problem down, 3 to go. Even though this is working, its sliders are super dirty. So I went back and revisited the sample and hold. I said there was a BJT and a JFET. It actually wasn't a JFET, it's a unijunction transistor. And I pulled that out. It's a 2N4870. And this is how it tests on my transistor tester. And you can see that there's continuity between pin 1 and pin 3. And there shouldn't be any continuity. I'll show you what a good one tests like. So here's a good unijunction transistor. This is a new old stock replacement of the same part, and you can see that it no longer indicates there's any continuity between pins 1 and 3. So basically our unijunction transistor had developed a short, or started to develop a short, and that's why our internal clock wasn't working. So we'll put this in, and hopefully there's no other problems in this area and our sample and hold will work. So after replacing that unijunction transistor, we can go test the sample and hold, or the clock output here. And we can see that we have a clock where we didn't before. So that op amp was dead and the unijunction transistor was dead. Now we have a clock going, and if it's making it to the sample and hold is working, we should have sample and hold now. But we don't have sample and hold, and what I notice is this sub-module, this solder joint right here is broken. I can just slide the sub-module up and down, and it's not soldered on there. So let's fix that and then see if we have sample and hold. So ever so gently roughing up that little brass rod or whatever, copper wire or whatever it is, and then applying some flux, I was able to get the joint to solder well. And now if I probe the output of the sample and hold, you can see I have a nice sample and hold on the oscilloscope. So I think we've got 2 down and 2 to go. So we're going to turn our attention now to the oscillators. Here I've folded board 2 up because I'm going to be changing out the op amp for the square wave of oscillator 1. This just shows you the boards themselves don't really have much going on there. I mean, I see 2 op amps, a handful of capacitors, and some resistors, but it's mostly just sliders and jacks on these boards. And sure enough, the op amp is bad. Actually, when I pop it in, it shorts out one of the supply lines, and it actually stops the other op amp from working. See there? Not only does this one test bad, but it shorts out the supply line, and now our good dual op amp isn't working. I pull this guy out, the dual op amp goes back to working. So we'll replace this with a nice new one, and hopefully that'll fix our square wave. So now it seems that we fixed all 4 things that were wrong with it. So we have oscillator 3 coming out of the left speaker too. We have oscillator 2 with sample and hold working. And we have oscillator 1. Also So all 4 problems fixed. So I've replaced this slider here, which had a broken shaft, and put all the slider caps back on from the other repairs, and this ARP 2600 is back in action and ready to go home. This has been Synthchaser from synthchaser.com. I hope you enjoyed this peek inside an ARP 2600. And if you have any questions, please post in the comments or hit me up on my website, synthchaser.com. Bye.